cover story conversation with Amish Tripathi, director at Nehru Center. He's also a minister for culture and education at the High Commission. But more importantly, he's the author of the Ramchandra series and the Shiva trilogy. He is actually, as someone very nicely described him, as the rock star of Indian literary fiction. He's the one who makes mythology and Indian cultures and tradition accessible for most of us. So welcome to this conversation, Amish. It's good to have you here.
Thank you, Priya. Absolute pleasure being here.
Before that, I want to talk to you first about G20 because it's also taking place in the amongst the backdrop of G20. What is the message that India is sending as a cultural superpower?
Look, at a broader level, this is in some ways a return of India. There was a time, if you read the figures of Angus Madison, India was by far the largest economy in the world in the first millennium. From the 11th century, we started declining, but only slowly. By the 17th, we were around 33% of the world's GDP in the first millennium. By the 17th century, we were down to around 22, 23, but we were still in the top two. Then the British Raj was disastrous for us. By the end of the British Raj, we came down, to around maybe 3-4% of the world's GDP. And our decline sadly continued even post-independence. Our lowest point in human history economically relative to the rest of the world was the late 1980s. Now, post-1991 reforms, we have come back. It's in a way a return to India and global power, not just politically, but in every way, culturally, every other way, is essentially based on economic power. As has been said so beautifully, Sukhasya Moolam Dharma, Dharmasya Moolam Artha. At the heart of everything is Artha, is wealth. As India returns economically as a powerful nation, you will see our footprint expanding everywhere, not just culturally. And that's what I think this occasion of G20 is, in a sense, signifying.
So my next question, Amish, to you is, cultural significance of India is there and it has been there. But in what way does it lend itself to the fact that we have someone like Narendra Modi at the helm?
What I think Prime Minister Modi does is speaks of India's deep cultural traditions in a very open way. For example, there was this book that had come out, Modi at 20, and I did a chapter in there on Prime Minister Modi's impact on our cultural space. So one part is what happens within India, and therefore then that impacts what happens of India outside. So, for example, something as simple as yoga. You'll be shocked to know, I'm living in the UK, you'll be shocked to know how many Westerners had started believing that yoga is not Indian. I'm telling you, you'll be shocked to know, okay? Till a few years ago. There were some who were actually propagating a theory that yoga emerged from Swedish stretching exercises, okay? And fortunately now, in the last few years, as with Prime Minister Modi's initiative, we have taken on the International Day of Yoga. Every year, there's a reminder to the entire world that yoga comes from India. We're not asking for copyright or, royalties on it, but you must acknowledge that the roots are Indian. Right. Something as simple as, there was I think it was in Harvard Medical Review, where someone had tried to present pranayam as cardiac coherence breathing. Okay. Like they've discovered something new. Right. And what it is essentially is a way to appropriate what are our traditions and, and show it as a Western invention. These things happen. Right. And unless we remember our own traditions, because we have then 1.4 billion ambassadors who will speak of Indian culture. What has happened over the last few centuries, regrettably, is that we have forgotten our own traditions and culture, right? In many aspects. And that's kind of sad. It's a result of our education system as well. I don't blame today's people for it. So I think this is one of the most critical things that Prime Minister Modi is doing, reviving, our deeper connect to our own culture, the revival of our temples in so many ways. All this is aiding that project.
But Amish, how is this being seen globally? Because, we also have a narrative that India is, there's a lot of Hindu-Muslim divide happening. So is Hinduism can it be used for its healing touch? Do you see more of that happening? And through people like you who are telling the stories, who are making it more accessible?
I do admit there is a narrative that is out in the West, and regrettably, this narrative that's put out has as much truth as the WMDs in Iraq narrative. I think the best way to see it is this. There's this Pew survey that had come out in 2021. Pew is one of the finest research organizations in the world. They do come out with qualitative surveys also, just researching, opinions of a few opinion makers. Those I don't put that much store on. But they've come out with fantastic quantitative surveys, which are actually, research of thousands of people. A research on religious attitudes had come out in India in 2021. I would urge you and all your, and everyone watching this to go find that report and read it. It fills you with so much hope and pride of what India is. How much Hindus were asked, would you go to the religious places of other religions? And over 90% said yes. They asked Muslims, do you believe in karma dharma, which are actually Hindu Buddhist concepts? Nearly 90% said yes. Over 90% said yes. Right? They asked, people that do you have the freedom to practice your religion? Vast majority of all religious groups said yes. And this shows the reality of India. Look, the point is this: there are 1.4 billion people of us. Okay, we have more people in India than all of North America, Europe, and the Middle East combined. Right now, if you want to make a narrative on a few incidents of 1.4 billion people, you can make any narrative, right? 1.4 billion people, you can get 20 incidents to show any narrative. But if you actually want to get to the truth, then you need actual hard data. And the Pew survey gives us that hard data. And even if you look at violence on a per capita basis, which is what you should do when you have a continental sized country like India or China, you have to look at per capita basis. You have to normalize for that. Per capita basis, violence rates are actually among the lowest in India. And let me tell you anecdotally as well. I lived in India I've always been an India boy. I never lived outside. I've traveled a great deal, but I always lived in India. For the first time, I've lived abroad in the UK right now. I've lived 4 years out here. I've seen muggings twice. I personally witnessed, right? For 45 years in India, I never saw a violent act. Okay. And it's not that I've only lived in, in upmarket areas, right? It says something about the kind of country we are, and we must put that truth across.
But now I'd like to talk about your books. Otherwise, the audience will never forgive me if I don't. If I have Amisha and I don't talk about the Ramchandra series and the Shiva trilogy. But your theory of karma, as it comes out in your books, if I've got it right, you really believe there are no good or bad people. There are strengths and weaknesses in Ram and in Ravan. But it's how you react to a circumstance that really defines your character. I mean, I may be putting it a bit badly, but if you can explain this point.
Ancient Indian way, there are no simplistic black and whites, right? And we realize that the world is and life is complicated. If you remember at the end of the Mahabharata, the text itself, I'm not sure if it was there in the TV series, but at the end of the Mahabharata, Duryodhan actually reaches, what is that? It's not a permanent heaven, it's a temporary heaven, right? But I won't go into those details. But Duryodhan is actually there. And the Pandavas, when they are walking up one by one, except Yudhishthir, the rest of them all fall down, right? And Yudhishthir reaches at the top and he sees Duryodhan out there. And I remember the first time I'd heard this from my parents, and I was, but this makes no sense. The Pandavas were, the good guys. Kauravas are the bad guys. What's Duryodhan doing out there? Why did the Pandavas fall down? And actually, answers are much more philosophical in the Indian way. Life is very complicated. The world is very complicated. There were some things that Ravan did, which even in the traditional way, the positives of it are shown, right? Uh, and so our entire ancient approach, in the ancient Indian approach, there was no concept of blasphemy. There was no concept of judgment, right? We used to look at others and try and learn without judgment and then apply lessons in our own life, right? And therefore, you look at, there's this concept called Viveka, that you have to see the totality of the situation and then make your own choice and then live with the consequences. There are no simplistic black and white. So if now that was the philosophical answer, let me break it down for you in everyday action, right? So for example, if we say ahimsa paramo dharma, right? Yes, it's true for you and me. We are ordinary citizens, but there's a context to this, right? A soldier at the border, he cannot say ahimsa parmo dharma. That's not his dharma. He has to fight, right? But equally for me as well, say I'm walking with some friends, right? And I see a woman being attacked, and there are five of us, and we can fight that man who's attacking her. Should we say ahimsa parmo dharma and stand at the back and just, say, oh, the world is so bad? Or should the five of us go out and fight, right? And try and protect that woman? Again, so it depends on the context, right? uh, and then for I cannot assume that my action will always lead to something positive. Maybe five of us will fight that guy and one of us could get badly hurt, right? Those are the consequences, right? So actions are complicated, and you take a decision basis, you make a choice basis the context you're in, and then live with the consequences. That is the Indian way. There's no simplistic follow these 10 rules and then you'll go to heaven. If you break it, you'll go to hell. We are treated like adults in our way. We are not treated like children.
In fact, that brings me to the other point that you also talk about, the Ashokan state and the Chanakya state, where, to put it very simply, individual actions are more important in a Chanakya state, while the Ashokan state wants to decide for you. And, you, I think, espouse the theory of a Chanakya state, but what do you see India as?
This is one of the things that comes down from our ancient governance traditions, and various people have spoken of this, various scholars, Sanjeev, Sanyal, and I think, Dr. Dev Roy, various others have spoken of this. I am a supporter of the Chanakyan state. The Chanakyan state, if I have to simplify it, was essentially a very minimal state. They'll do a few things, do it very well, leave the rest to society, right? The Ashokan state was an expansive state, will interfere in everything. The Ashokan state, for example, had the equivalent of, a ministry for the promotion of virtue and the prevention of vice, right? They encourage vegetarianism, for example, the Ashokan state, or not, sacrificing animals at a certain age. The Chanakyan state was, let the society decide, it's none of my business, right? Why do I support the Chanakyan state? If you read Acharya Chanakya's texts themselves, his entire thing was that actually, primarily, it didn't go into the modern Western approach of individual rights and collective identity. It wasn't on a philosophical approach, it was on a practical approach. He said that you cannot trust a state that has become too expensive. His entire point was that to prevent the corruption of a government servant is as difficult as if a fish is swimming through water. How much water is it actually drinking? Okay, he used that example. So his entire thing was actually, you must reduce the power of the government employee to impact society as much as possible, which means the state should not do too many things, right? Leave the rest to society, do only those things which only the state can do, which is what essentially, first of all, law and order, and protection from external enemies, building core infrastructure, regulation, right? A few basic things, and leave the rest to society. That leads to a healthier society. I'm a supporter of that kind of state. Regrettably, what we have built post the British Raj is more of an Ashokan state. Let's see if we can get to a Chanakyan state.
Well, yes, and if we believe in the prime minister, then he has one more term coming his way to walk us towards the Chanakya state. One more question. I want to also go a bit on the philosophical note, and what you speak on your books about. In one point, I think in the War of Lanka, which I read most recently, you say the end is not so important as the means. There is an instance where they are distributing, where Ram Chandra are distributing medicines, I think, to the Sri Lankan army, and he's questioned
Enemy.
why you did that. Yeah. So
it's again, what I was speaking about earlier. In the Indian way, you can have, it depends on the context, and it depends on, so there are supporters for both sides. Lord Krishna's approach, for example, was that the end justifies the means, and Lord Krishna clearly showed that, right, in the Mahabharata. He would do what he had to do to ensure that the correct end was achieved. Lord Ram's approach was that if you take the wrong means, you may end up at the wrong end as well, right? So not just the end, even your means should be proper, right? And that was Lord Ram's approach. There are two different approaches. Now, which path is better or worse? Now, like I said earlier, in the Indian way, there is no better or worse. It depends on the context, right? If you're fighting an enemy who himself will never will have a code as well, right? Then perhaps Lord Ram's way is better. But if you're fighting an enemy, like perhaps in the modern world, one of our neighbors who, does not have much of a code, then should you follow the Lord Krishna approach? Uh, Now, these are things that one has to kind of calmly take a decision on, because both the models are there in the Indian way. What is the context, and which comes back to what I had said earlier, that we have to have the viveka to understand the context. Our Western neighbor, should we have the Lord Ram approach or the Lord Krishna approach? My personal opinion, perhaps, is the Lord Krishna approach with our Western neighbor. It depends, like I said, on the context.
Well, thank you, Amish, for this point that you raised. We're going to just take a short break. I'm going to come back and keep you going on this point. So stay with us. Hello and welcome back to a cover story conversation with Amish Tripathi. Amish, before the break, we were talking about the Krishna way and the Arjun way, where discussing
And the Lord
ways
Ram way.
and the Lord Ram way. Yes. Is there a difference between the three?
Yeah, because like I said, Lord Krishna, if one has to look at it, I'm simplifying. I'm
Yeah.
simplifying a lot. But Lord Krishna's approach was the end justifies the means. Whereas Lord Ram's approach was you have to follow the right means, otherwise you'll end up at the wrong end. And there are two different approaches. And in the traditional Indian way, there's no thing of what is right or wrong. They're just two different approaches, and you decide what is the right approach depending on the context.
Fair enough. The context, yeah, that's what we were discussing. The context is really what is very important. Also, the characterization, the way, because what you're writing is mythological fiction. And I read an interview of Devdutt Patnaik saying that what he writes is mythology and what you write is mythological fiction. So, in a way, yours is a little subjective, as to how you see. I'm very interested in the character of Sita, as you say. You see her not just as the docile Sita that we've all been hearing about, but as a warrior queen, as someone, who's actually very independent minded and can fight for herself.
This the image that we have of Sita Ma in the modern day is based largely on a 1980s television serial. And and regrettably, our education system is such that we are not teaching our ancient versions, right? So even in the original Valmiki Ramayana, she's not a warrior, but she's a very strong woman with her own agency, a very strong character, right? There are versions like the Adbhut Ramayana, which is also credited to Valmiki ji, where she is a warrior. She's the one who kills the elder Ravan, right? So we had various versions of Sita Ma in different versions of the Ramayana. And I would really urge, we must read our ancient versions, and I wish our education system starts teaching this, and not just in the Ramayana, in our other traditions as well. This thing that we are told that you have to be Western to respect women's rights. No, actually, you have to be truly Indian to respect women's rights, because that's what
Explain that.
were. If you read our ancient texts, so I just gave you examples from the Ramayana, but not that. Our oldest scriptures, the Rig Veda, right? And the Rig Veda is written by the equivalents of Middle Eastern prophets and messiahs. That's what the rishis were, right? Because they communicated with the divine and translated that message for us ordinary people. The Rig Veda has hymns of rishikas as well, women rishis, right? Many modern Indians don't know this. We had the equivalent of women prophets and messiahs in ancient times. Show me other cultures which had this, right? We had women who ruled in their own name. I've given these examples so many times. Rani Prabhavati Gupta, Rudrama Devi. They used to lead their armies into the battle. They ruled in their own name. The coins would be struck on their name, not that they were the regent of a male this thing. We had women who founded universities, like Vallabhi University in ancient times.
Hmm.
It was destroyed by the invaders. So ours was actually a very equal society. We lost a lot of that, over the last few centuries. Any society that suffers a lot of random violence, the rights of women do tend to go down. As you can see, for example, even in the Kurdish areas of the Middle East, the Kurds
Hmm.
used to give women a lot of equality. But as they've suffered more and more random violence, you'll notice that societies are changing a bit, and that's what happened to India too. But my point is, the last 75 years, the invasions and the random violence has stopped. So we have no excuse anymore. We must return to our ancient ways where men and women were treated as equal.
Right. Did you not wince a bit when I asked you about mythology versus mythological fiction? I saw are you
It's
happy with that comparison?
it's one of those things that goes into debates at times. Like
Hmm.
I try to stay away from this debate because, at least, look, I think, often we lose the bigger picture on arguing over minor points like words.
Hmm.
Uh,
Right.
Now, did the British have an insidious agenda in using the word mythology? Yes, they did. Because any non-Christian, which is not their culture, would be reduced to mythology. That's not really true, right? Even their own Greco-Roman traditions were converted into myths. You know that our myths are not true, but their traditions are history, right?
Right. Hmm.
And you can find, like, Herodotus is considered the father of history in the Western way. Herodotus wrote that the ears of elephants were wings to fly, right? So what kind of father of history was he, right? So you can find fanciful stuff. There was a talking snake, right, in their
Hmm.
tradition, who convinced Eve to eat an apple. But
Correct.
I respect that approach. I don't have that approach. That's not true, because we don't get into the debate of mythology and history. We think these are stories from which we should learn philosophies. There was a Western and a British insidious approach to denigrate non-Western cultures, non-Christian cultures, calling all their traditions as myths. I admit that that is true. Um, but we don't have to behave just like they did, you know. And for me, this getting into this, mythology history debate it's a minor point, and it's a waste of time, because I believe that my traditions are real. I don't need to prove that to any British guy. uh, so I prefer, when I speak in Hindi, I always say itihasa, right? When I speak in English, I would say our legends. But if someone says mythology, okay, take your choice. But that doesn't mean that I don't believe in it. I do believe in it.
So you'd say, I like your suggestion. You really, you said earlier also that Ramayana and Mahabharata should be accessible at the earlier age, and maybe as
Yes,
part of our education.
yes, it must. And our traditional gurukuls did have that. Okay.
Right.
So there's this wonderful book called The Beautiful Tree. Okay, written
Hmm.
by Dharpalji. I don't know if you've read that. He was a Gandhian, and he wrote a book on what our Indian education system was before the British took it over and took over India and destroyed it. Right. And he based this on British records, on British gazettes, because
Hmm.
there is a certain group in India which will not believe anything till there's a white man stamp on it. So this book is actually based on what the white man wrote of our education system. And The Beautiful Tree is a very insightful book. I'd encourage all of your viewers to read it. It tells us what our education system was like. Let me give you a few things. That broadly, we had gurukuls, pathshalas, and madrasas. They were there in practically every village. So education was widespread. Okay, this thing that we have in the modern day, that Muslim women, didn't used to learn, at least not true in India. Madrasas had a vast number of women, of girl children learning as well. So at least Indian Muslims did not have this bias, right? Gurukuls had, and they were caste breakups as well. So it wasn't dominated by upper caste. Actually, there were majority backward castes, right? In the Gurukuls and the Pacha. Again, this was recorded by British. Okay. Then the education system was, they didn't just teach religious philosophies. They would teach mathematics. So Bhaskaracharya's Lilavati was used to teach mathematics. They used to teach physics. They used to teach sciences. So we actually had a good education system. Part of it was the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. It used to be taught as like the beginning text in all our education systems, because it didn't just teach you a story, which connected you to our traditions. They also taught you philosophies of learning how to live. They also taught you various other things, like the Shanti Parva and the Mahabharata is in effect a governance lesson, right? Sugriva, sending his Vanar Sena to search for goddess Sita, which is there in the Valmiki Ramayana, is in effect a geography lesson, right? So they used to teach basics in the garb of a story as well, and also most importantly teach you philosophies of learning how to live. Our modern education system doesn't teach you that. They only teach you skills, right? They don't teach you how to make choices. We end up creating robots who don't know how to make choices and lead a productive life, lead a good life.
Wow, Mish, this is you. I can see why you're also wearing your hat as the Minister of Education at the Commission. Thank you for this. We've had a different kind of a conversation, but I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for this conversation, and wish you all the best. And we hope to see you in India soon.
Certainly. Take care, Priya. Pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.